Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are diving deep into an exhaustive, scholarly analysis of a historical narrative that is, frankly, incredibly misunderstood: the ancient Israelite conquest of Canaan. For decades now, casual readers and even some seasoned critics have framed this ancient military campaign as a kind of generalized ethnic genocide. But when we actually stop and evaluate the ancient texts through the precise lens of ancient Near Eastern cosmic geography, alongside some really strict linguistic analysis, a radically different picture starts to emerge. We're going to see that this conquest was absolutely not some indiscriminate slaughter of indigenous populations. Far from it. Rather, it was a highly targeted theological strike against specific hybridized bloodlines. It was a calculated campaign designed to break a literal supernatural blockade. We're going to be unpacking all of this through a deeply academic framework today, relying heavily on peer-reviewed textual analysis to uncover the exact nature of this ancient conflict. So let's get started. Here's our roadmap for the analysis. First, defining the giant clans. Second, the cosmic war framework. Third, dispossession versus utter destruction. Fourth, the spared relative nations. And finally, Joshua's targeted strategy. Okay, let's dive into Section 1, defining the giant clans, focusing specifically on the Nephilim descendants. Now, the biblical narrative actually draws a really sharp chronological distinction between the original antediluvian entities and their later counterparts. Let's look at the timeline. Before the Great Flood, the Nephilim first appear on the earth as the direct result of a severe cosmic transgression. According to Genesis chapter 6, divine beings, who are referred to in the text as the sons of God, rebelled and mated with human women. This was a completely unauthorized intersection of the divine and human realms, and it produced a physical lineage that was fundamentally illegitimate in the eyes of Yahweh. But here's where it gets complicated, right? Despite the massive, global nature of the flood narrative, which, remember, was intended to wipe out this exact corruption, these lineages actually re-emerged. Genesis 6:4 explicitly notes their presence before the flood and also afterward. So how exactly did they come back? Well, to explain how these lineages reappeared specifically in the Levant, we have to turn to the rigorous work of ancient Near Eastern scholars. According to Dr. Michael Heiser, biblical and extra-biblical traditions point to two primary possibilities for this reemergence. Either the flood was a massive but localized event that simply didn't reach the specific geographic regions where these remnant groups existed, or, alternatively, there was a subsequent second incursion of rebellious divine beings who generated new hybrid offshoots after the waters receded. Regardless of the specific mechanism of their return, their historical footprint is undeniable. By the Middle Bronze Age, these lineages had fractured into various highly formidable tribes. We're talking primarily about the Anakim, the Emim, and the Rephaim, and they deeply entrenched themselves throughout the ancient Levant. You really have to think of them not just as loose nomadic tribes, but as heavily militarized regional superpowers that completely dominated the Middle Bronze Age landscape. As ancient biblical historians establish, by the time Abraham traversed the land, these post-flood giant clans, the Rephaim, Emim, and Zuzim, were already heavily established across Canaan and the Transjordan. And according to ancient Near Eastern scholars, this is an absolutely critical geographic reality that we have to grasp if we want to understand a conquest. Think about it. Long before Moses or Joshua ever mobilized the Israelite armies, centuries prior to the Exodus even happening, these specific clans already held ironclad dominion over vast tracts of territory. From the Bashan region way up in the north, stretching all the way down through the Transjordanian Plateau, their presence was just immense. They weren't a minor historical footnote that Israel just happened to bump into. They were entrenched regional superpowers, and they were functioning as heavily fortified obstacles sitting exactly in the territory that had been covenantally promised to Abraham. Moving right along to Section 2, the cosmic war framework and the concept of a spiritual blockade. When you look at this through an ancient Near Eastern supernatural worldview, the conquest of Canaan was never just some physical battle for land. It was, fundamentally, a cosmic war. And the theological framework for this entire conflict actually begins at the Tower of Babel. According to Deuteronomy 32:8 and 9, when Yahweh disinherited the nations at Babel, he divided humanity up and placed those different nations under the authority of lesser divine beings, again, those sons of God. But, as we know, these lesser divine beings rebelled against Yahweh's ultimate authority. So, when Yahweh subsequently called Abraham and designated this specific strip of land, Canaan, as his own localized inheritance, those rebellious spiritual powers didn't just sit back. They strategized a massive counter-offensive. According to Dr. Heiser, these entities intentionally raised up the hybrid giant bloodlines, the Rephaim, the Anakim, and the others, to heavily occupy the exact land promised to Abraham. Their objective here was entirely hostile, and it was highly calculated. By saturating Canaan with their own progeny, these rebellious divine beings were setting up a literal, physical, and spiritual blockade. To put that into perspective using modern terms, this was the ultimate geopolitical proxy war. The rebellious entities were using these giant clans as a physical buffer zone, stationed right at the gates of the Promised Land. The entire goal was to make it militarily and physically impossible for the Israelites to ever enter and claim the covenant land, which would, in turn, completely thwart Yahweh's overarching redemptive plan for humanity. So the crucial point we need to unpack is right here in section 3, dispossession versus utter destruction. Now, if you read the text carefully, the biblical narrative uses highly specific, distinctively different verbs and instructions for the different populations residing within the land of Canaan. On one hand, we have this concept of dispossession, which is often translated in English as driving out. The original Hebrew terms for this action, words like yirash or garash, literally denote eviction, displacement, or deportation. And for the vast majority of the human Canaanite population, this was actually the primary command. So why just evict them? Well, because the threat that these average, fully human Canaanite groups posed was strictly cultural and spiritual. Their deeply idolatrous practices, which notoriously included things like child sacrifice, would morally contaminate Israel. Therefore, the main objective was simply to evict them from the specific covenant borders. According to careful textual analysis, you obviously cannot make a treaty with a population that has been completely eradicated, right? Yet the book of Deuteronomy expressly commands Israel not to make treaties with these groups, which logically proves they were fully expected to survive and live outside of Israel's newly established borders. But on the other hand, we have this very different, very intense concept of harem, or utter destruction. This is a severe, scorch-the-earth policy where a population, and oftentimes their goods, are entirely devoted to Yahweh, meaning they are completely and permanently removed from human use. Let's define this formally, because it's so important. Harem is the absolute devotion of a population and their goods to destruction. But the vital academic distinction we have to make here is the actual application of this specific command. According to Dr. Heiser's authoritative analysis in his book, The Unseen Realm, the command of harem, that heavy decree to not leave alive anything that breathes, was highly, highly specific. It was absolutely not a blanket decree for ethnic genocide or some indiscriminate carpet bombing of all Canaanite people. Not at all. Rather, it was a surgical military strike applied only to specific cities and geographic strongholds. And why those places? Because those precise locations were the known, concentrated hubs of the Anakim, Rephaim, and Amorite giant clans. The strict target of harem was this demonic seed, the physical legacy of those rebellious divine beings. While the average Canaanites were definitely pagan idolaters, they were still fully human. The giant clans, however, represented an existential, cosmic threat. They couldn't merely be displaced to a neighboring region. They had to be eliminated. Now, scholars have a fascinating term for the application of harem against these specific lineages. They call it chaos maintenance, because the very existence of these hybrid clans was seen as a direct extension of primeval chaos and spiritual corruption. Their complete eradication was viewed as a necessary act of cosmic purification. Think of it like deep cleaning a localized space. It was about clearing out this hybrid spiritual corruption from the Promised Land so that Yahweh's absolute holiness could actually dwell there safely amongst his people. It was a systematic, calculated purge of a localized, supernatural threat, not a generalized war against human ethnicity. Which brings us nicely to Section 4, the spared relative nations, providing us with a really fascinating case study in exemption. As the Israelites marched toward Canaan, Moses explicitly commanded them not to provoke, harass, or wage war against 3 specific neighboring nations: Edom, Moab, and Ammon. Now, this exemption was rooted in some profound covenantal affiliations. Yahweh recognized these specific nations as Israel's direct genealogical family, and as we know, ancient geopolitical borders were highly respected when close family ties were involved, especially if those relatives had already done the heavy lifting of fighting off giants in their own backyards. The Edomites were the descendants of Jacob's twin brother Esau. The Moabites and Ammonites were the descendants of Lot, Abraham's nephew. Furthermore, Yahweh explicitly stated that he had sovereignly allotted the region of Seir to Esau and the regions of Ar and Ammon to the descendants of Lot as their very own divine inheritances. Israel had absolutely no theological or geographic right to their lands whatsoever. Now, what's really interesting about this is the underlying data. The most compelling reason these relative nations were spared from harem warfare is that they had already successfully completed the exact same cosmic task in their own territories. As detailed in Deuteronomy chapter 2, verses 10 through 23, these non-Israelite nations had faced the exact same terrifying hybrid adversaries that Israel was so afraid of. Just look at the data here. Edom had successfully destroyed and displaced the Horites, who carried very strong Rephaim associations from Mount Seir. Moab had destroyed the Emim, which was a massive Rephaim tribe noted to be as tall and formidable as the Anakim. And Ammon had utterly dispossessed the Zamzummim, yet another formidable branch of the Rephaim. According to Dr. Heiser, God was actively working behind the scenes to help these Abrahamic relatives destroy the giant lineages long before Joshua and Moses even arrived on the scene. Because Edom, Moab, and Ammon had already successfully purged the Nephilim descendants from their allotted regions, the necessary chaos maintenance was already complete. There was absolutely zero theological mandate for Israel to wage harem warfare in those lands. Let's wrap this up with Section 5, Joshua's targeted strike strategy. When you look at the texts, the historical record is remarkably precise. It says, "At that time, Joshua came and wiped out the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anub. Joshua utterly destroyed them with their towns. None of the Anakim was left in the land of the Israelites. Some remained only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod." According to Joshua 11:21 and 22, this is exactly how the military campaign unfolded. This text is absolutely paramount. It proves unequivocally that Joshua did not systematically march from village to village, hunting down every human Canaanite he could find. Instead, he executed highly targeted, surgical strikes against specific administrative and military centers like Hebron and Debir that were specifically known to house the Anakim populations. The mandate of harem was unleashed directly and exclusively upon the supernatural blockade. And this brilliantly illustrates the entire operational sequence of the conquest. Let's walk through it. Step 1, Joshua's military forces actively targeted the specific stronghold cities of the Anakim and Rephaim. Step 2, they executed the strict mandate of harem in those specific locales to entirely wipe out the hybrid bloodlines, ensuring that the rebellious cosmic legacy was completely cut off. Now, step 3 is highly revealing. Once these specific giant clans were cleared from Israel's allotted territory, leaving remnants only over in Philistine cities like Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod, the military campaign abruptly ended. The text literally states the land had rest from war. Now, wait a minute. Why did the war stop if thousands of regular Canaanites were still living there? Because the primary theological objective, the elimination of the Nephilim bloodlines from the Promised Land, had been successfully completed. Which leads us directly to step 4. The remaining average human Canaanite populations were no longer subjected to the harem, utter destruction. Instead, they were to be gradually driven out or dispossessed by the individual tribes of Israel over a long period of time. So, we have traversed a vast amount of academic and theological terrain today, deconstructing some major modern assumptions and realigning our perspective with the worldview of the ancient Near Eastern texts. By recognizing the highly targeted nature of harem against these giant clans, the whole narrative shifts from a deeply troubling tale of ethnic eradication to a highly calculated, cosmic defensive strategy against a literal, supernatural blockade. So I want to leave you with this final provocative thought to consider today. If the ancient conquest was ultimately an act of cosmic chaos maintenance, a war waged against the physical legacy of rebellious divine beings, what does that really reveal about the unseen spiritual dimensions of our ancient history? Just how much of human history has been shaped by forces operating just beyond the veil of our immediate perception? Thank you so much for joining me in this deep scholarly analysis. Keep questioning, keep studying, and I will see you in the next explainer.